And now we're recording our next episode of You, Me, and ICED for another fantastic subject to talk about today. I'm sure every single one of you have read or watched a movie or played a game or, seen other sorts of visual art regarding the building of a fantasy world. I mean, for example, Game of Thrones, was recently incredibly popular, and that involved building an entirely different fantasy world. I mean, complete with maps and languages and religions and everything. I mean, the landscapes and creatures that don't exist in our real world, but they do exist in the Game of Thrones world, like those huge dragons, that we were all so fond of watching every week. So when we, as fantasy writers, start to build a world of all these wonderful things, how do you manage, to balance things in life? You're building this world, and sometimes, in my experience, it can become overwhelming. I mean, you can literally, it can kind of take over all your days because you're imagining, what your characters would be able to do, what sort of abilities they should be able to have, what sort of these worlds that they encounter. What sort of landscapes do they have? What sort of creatures do they have? What sort of plants do they have? What languages do they speak? And so on and so forth. And it sort of gets you so wrapped up that, I don't know, sometimes it's hard to come back, from your little trip. Well, Richard's over there nodding his head like, yeah, I know exactly about that. So I'm going to give the floor to him right away. Go ahead, Richard. Take us there.
Okay, well, when I start, I don't normally have much of an idea what sort of world I'm going to be creating. I try and start with something that's normal and familiar. So the first page of most of my books is generally someone doing something that we all do. So they might be going into a hotel room or waking up or just walking down the street, effectively. And it's something familiar. It's something that you can relate to. And then I'll start to throw in bits and pieces that show that you're not in Kansas anymore. But the way I look at it, yes, it can be very complicated. But if you're not careful, you can fall into the trap of creating a world and then having to juggle your story to fit into it, and you end up having to mess around with everything you've just created just to make everything fit. So the way I do it, I only create things when I need them.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'll take the case of Ribbon World. I had the bloke in the first page. He started off with, arriving in a hotel room. Well, everyone knows what a hotel room looks like. There's a bit of a corridor, and there's a bathroom, and there's a bed, and there's a cupboard, and there's a window that's usually got curtains pulled across it. So I left it there, and I put him there for a bit, and then he went and pulled the curtains back, and then I could introduce something else, and he looked out on an alien landscape. Now, that's it. But I didn't have to.
There would be something otherworldly in that landscape, yeah. I'm assuming, right?
Yeah. And then as his life progressed, as it does in our daily lives, the more he moved around, the more he saw. So the more I had to create. But I didn't create anything until I actually needed it as part of the story. I suggested things, but I never actually made anything solid until it was required. And I think doing it that way, it's a lot easier because you haven't got to agonize for hours over what color the plants are or what the religion is, because you only use it when you need it. That's just my theory anyway.
Well, I like that. It doesn't put too much pressure on you right away. It just sort of, I like the idea of letting it sort of unfold piece by piece, and you sort of explain, you kind of, it's you experience it maybe as the reader would in that case, right? It's like suddenly there's, a glimpse of something that doesn't belong in our world, and you're like, what was that? Like, wait a minute. The
thing about that is you can suggest in a way that your character's doing things, and it makes the reader wonder what they're doing in the same situation because they're then invested in it. Yeah.
So Richard,
go on.
Is your background for this podcast, or is that one of your books?
That is my textbook. I actually wrote a textbook on world building for science fiction. I used to give talks at literary events, And of course, when we had the first lockdown, I had to stop doing that. So I got all my talks and I compiled them into a book, and then just put it on Amazon so that anyone who never saw one of my wonderful lectures can just go and read it.
Oh, wow.
It was the first book I bought of yours, and it's been really useful.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
And it's titled Creating a Sci-Fi World. So it's so appropriate
right, yeah.
what we're talking about.
That's so wonderful. Yeah, so he literally wrote the book on the subject.
I wrote one of the books, yeah. People all over the world have bought this. I've had sales of this in Mexico and South America and all sorts of places that I never expected to sell an English language book in, because I haven't translated it at all. It's in English and there you are.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's brilliant. Just brilliant. And it's available, I'm assuming, on Amazon and anywhere else, or is it mostly an Amazon?
It's on Amazon as an ebook and a paperback.
Wonderful.
There's all my notes in there. There's a few samples so I can show you what I've been doing, and there's a few exercises as well to get you thinking, and a couple of free short stories at the back to show you basically what I've done.
Wow. What a wonderful idea for a book. I think that everybody who, I mean, we know this guy, okay? All of us really know him. I mean, and we know the kind of books that Richard has written. So let me just go right on the record right now to recommend this book. If you really want to get into writing, building a world, building a sci-fi world or a fantasy world, and writing a book, you could probably learn a lot from somebody who's written like, a couple how many? A couple dozen? 3 dozen?
My 29th will be out in September.
29.
Wow.
Awesome. Yeah. That's so cool. Coolness, really. And you know what? I guess this is the point in the podcast where we do a little commercial for ourselves. Mr. B said, there's Richard's right there. So go on Amazon and find his book and buy it right away. And don't forget to drop a review. Every time you buy a book from an independent author, please drop a review on Amazon or wherever you're getting it from, Barnes and Noble's website, Kobo, Smashwords, whatever, reviews help us. Goodreads as well. That's a good one to leave a review on. So here's mine. This is the hardback version of the Buchanan Bastard, which seems to be on sale on Amazon right now. There's a little percentage, discount on it, but the nice collector's edition hardcover is right there. See that?
That looks really nice. Yeah.
It's really nice. Yeah, I'm really, really proud of how that baby turned out. It's a crime thriller, and it's doing incredibly well. Set in New Orleans, Mardi Gras, in the 1970s, the groovy 1970s. And there's a double homicide to start it off. International espionage to carry it through, and familial, wonderful familial arguments, to top it off, just in Southern fashion. So it's got it all. It really does. You'll never be bored, not for a second.
So I know Lene does a lot of artwork, and I have some of her little special artwork with me.
Oh.
I'm always curious what's in the background, which always makes me think there's clothespins on a line. Then I see the S for sci-fi, but then I also see the S for $. What is it?
You're on the... Well, that is actually a massive canvas that's standing about 3 yards away from me, and it's full of these satin little art dolls that I've joined together holding hands. I've sewed it onto the canvas, and it does represent the $, but it also represents cryptocurrencies. And I call them the blockheads because opinions are very divided on the blockchain and stupidity and risking everything, the rewards, the whole social commentary. So I sometimes like to tell stories through my art as well. And I have actually, Dedra, I did send you a message earlier, but I've been working this week. I'm mentoring 2 writers, both in Dubai. One of them is a lady from America, but Mexican-American. And another lady is from the Philippines who's here in Dubai. And both of them are writing amazing little short stories for our anthology. And I'm helping them bring
Wonderful.
that up to the correct level so that they have an absolute little proper arc and fascinating characters, take them to the best level they can be, so that we can introduce more authors on this platform and bring them some joy and recognition and some reward, because writing is a lonely career.
It really is. And it'll be so great to have 2 more writers in the anthology, which is going to be named Human Horizons, by the way. And we apologize that it's taking so long to get that one going, but it really is something that Lene and I both work on in our very tiny amount of spare time. So bear with us.
It's a passion project. It's not
It
fast
is.
food. This is this perfectly slow cooked stew, like a brisket, that's going to take however long it takes, but it's going to be worth it.
True. And for all of those of you who love brisket, you can appreciate that. There's nothing like slow cooked brisket, man. Apologies to the vegans out there. My apologies. I do respect you.
So I know I'm missing my iced tea today, but over here in Houston is as hot as Dubai. So I think even in the nighttime it's in the 30s and it's getting all the way to 33, 34 and more.
It is.
And some parts of the United States is really warm. But Richard said something pertaining to not doing things until you need it, which makes sense to why even create a world of behind a window if no one is ever going to open the window. And in the advertising moment, I always come up with a backdrop, like how you have You, Me, and ICED. I always have Free Talk with Mr. B, and I'm always in the virtual studio. With that being said, I don't create, and we even in this program, Free Talk with Mr. B, You, Me, and ICED on Free Talk, we don't create the words before we utter them. We do not script anything we're talking about, but we know the topic and the subject. And the same thing I had this morning, another podcast series is called Adult Communication. And they also have the other podcast series called Love Your Children. And all of these things are things that come over naturally because we know the subject. So if it was like creating a sci-fi world, it would have been creating a podcast that only gets created exactly when we need it that very day. And so the world of podcasting is created by impromptu speaking, impromptu recording like we are now, and impromptu production of this podcasting world. And so all of us as artists in our backgrounds say the same thing in the sense that we're compatible with each other to produce our results only when we need it for most part. So
yes, absolutely.
Cool. And of course you can find Free Talk with Mr. B and You, Me, and ICED, and it's very popular on YouTube on the channel. You know, there's so many listeners each time, and it's on podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. Maybe it's even on iHeartRadio. Just Google Free Talk with Mr. B, and you'll see all of the different series that's being ran.
Right. Oh, it's so wonderful. Mr. B has got quite a smorgasbord of podcast titles for people to listen to. And I do recommend podcast lovers to, hurry on down there and check out all these episodes, because it's a lot better than listening to music in the car. It's so much nicer to put on a nice podcast and sort of let people talk to you about things that matter, along the way when you're stuck in that terrible traffic jam.
Yeah, and it has over 140 episodes available, including all the You, Me, and ICED episodes. So since we've been running,
that's quite an accomplishment. Well done.
It's kind of exciting to have a variety of things to listen to for about 20-30 minutes, and you can just relax.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And who knows where that will go. That's the nice thing about world building. It sort of leaves the door open to create worlds beyond the worlds. I mean, just look at, say, for example, how superhero comics, create, more superhero comics out of strains of, an original story, an origin story, and then you'll get a story that branches off of that, and then they'll come back and connect to like a prequel story, a prequel origin story. I mean, the limits are not there. There's no limit.
Like Richard said, you don't need to create a villain until you need one.
I want to oppose that view.
I kind of oppose that theory too. I was going to say, but you go first, Lene.
Okay, well, Richard's storytelling style is amazing. He gets an idea and he sort of downloads it from, I don't know, a higher consciousness place or some amazing well of creativity, and it just flows. For the writers who don't work that way, if you are inspired by something really strange or out of place or awkward, and that sparked your story, then you start building from that nugget. And the best example of this is when Stephen King was inspired to write The Fog, or The Mist, as it's been published in various versions over the years. Now, I don't know if you saw that show. Typical military accident, fog, strange creatures, people trapped in a supermarket. And he said the inspiration came one day when he was walking down the supermarket aisle with this low chest freezer in the middle of frozen food. And in his mind's eye, he just pictured a pterodactyl flying across it. And that's where the whole story came from.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be like Tolkien creating new languages and reworking mythologies and stuff. But we, at this age, in our era now, we've seen nature programs. We know the biomes of the world. We know life cycles of plants, insects, predators, the apex, the food chain, factory production technology. You don't have to create so much new stuff, but at the same time, your readers are more sophisticated as well. So if you do put something in your book, please run it by whatever experts you can find, because they love to talk about their subject matter, and they will happily pull it apart or give you great advice saying you don't need to work on the 75-year life cycle of this kind of horrible cockroach that arises whenever Earth and Venus are in alignment. But it's useful to know that if there is such an insect on Earth, it is plausible. And any reader who argues, you can just say, I based it off that, and you can move on. You don't have to explain your world to people, but it has to make sense. So that's just what I want to say.
Absolutely.
That's very true. It was Isaac Asimov who said nothing has to be true, but everything has to sound true. And
yes.
The perfect saying. And how I look at that is, everything I write, even though it's set thousands of years in the future, is based on a scientific fact. It doesn't matter what you do to it after that is relatively immaterial. In 200 years, who knows what they will have produced from a basic idea. But as long as the basic idea is sound, you can play with it as much as you like, and nobody can ever find a fault in it, because the science that underpins it is sound. There's things you can't do now, but who knows what you can do tomorrow. But as long as it comes from somewhere sensible, then you can get away with it, basically.
I agree with that. I mean, if you're looking back at the original Star Trek episodes, I mean, which are my all-time favorite, by the way, the Captain Kirk gang and everything. I mean, the way they talk to each other and they're communicators, they're basically cell phones. I mean, that was back in the 60s. So that was considered like really space age technology back then. But here we have them as everyday things now. And even that would be like an old fashioned Nokia phone, the one they've got in the 60s episodes, right? I mean, we've got way more spacey sort of, smartphones now that can do amazing things. And Independence Day, the movie Independence Day, where they had the aliens, were using a touch screen. That was long before touch screens were ever invented. Amazing stuff. You're right. I mean, it could be even an inspiration for, people creating these sorts of technologies, telephone technology companies. I mean, it's amazing how one sort of precurses the other.
I know I've been flying around the world quite a bit, and sometimes I wish they learned how to beam me up, because it's taking too long to get through the airport sometimes. But the closest thing I have and really appreciate is airdrop. So
Airdrop.
nice.
Yes.
So many
See,
things
there you
like an
go.
airdrop. I was like, that is close to beam me up as I can get, right?
At least it beams up your information.
Yes,
So
it does it very
until they
nicely.
manage to beam us up, I agree with you, Mr. B. That would be the ultimate way to travel, to be beamed up somewhere. I would love that.
I read a scientific discussion once where they hypothesized the reason they can't beam us around is because they would have to beam all of the microorganisms in our body along with us, and that's very complex.
Oh, and kind of gross.
Well,
We do
the
have
good
an entire
bacteria, you know.
ecosystem living on our body, do we not? I mean, in our hair, on our skin. Yeah, I don't want to get into it. It's kind of gnarly, but they're harmless. You know,
But that's
they
a
have
new
a
world.
function.
That's a new world to create. You know,
Exactly.
what a
Exactly.
science fiction talking about all of those creatures walking around us.
You know
There's-
what? I can even go back to, oh, sorry. I just was reminded of Horton Hears a Who. You know, remember the Dr. Seuss book? I mean, the elephant, the Horton that walks around with the entire world that's on a, what's that called? A dandelion? You know,
Yeah.
they're on a
Oh,
speck. And you just,
yes.
I mean, it sort of boggled the mind, even when I was a kid. That's why Dr. Seuss was one of my favorite authors as a child. You know, it really stretched your imagination to think. I mean, could we be like that? Are we a tiny little world on somebody's dandelion, and another more giant creature than us is walking around with us? I mean,
And in our
gosh,
minds,
the possibilities
you
are
know,
endless, right?
and in our minds we were, because there was a time we thought we were going to fall off the edge of the earth because it was so flat, right? And so again,
True.
when they have microorganisms on the head of a pin or microorganisms on a dandelion, the concern is falling off the edge.
Falling off the edge of the world.
Right?
Yeah,
And so
that
that
was
was
so
their world.
Sir Terry Pratchett did it the best with the Discworld. He took every little myth and misconception and pushed it to the extreme. If you sit and analyze the Discworld books, he didn't have to create so much of a new world as just point out the absurdities of ours, but in a new skin. So yeah, from world building down to entire micro ecosystems and large religions and culture and stuff. There's so much around us on Earth already. If you just do a bit of research, it already exists in some form somewhere. And there really is not that much new under the sun. But that's why when you come across a new idea, my first thought always is, okay, who's done this before? Where have I seen this? And I thought it's my original idea. So I'd say for writers working on world building is do a lot of research and make sure you're not inadvertently copying another author's world building or a popular TV show, because in our memory, our dreams are as real as the reality we experience, and therefore false memories are a thing. Ideas are actually just convoluted conversations you heard last week in a supermarket, superimposed in a weird psychological way. I mean, that's a whole different topic, but yes, while it is great to try and be too original, don't put so much pressure on yourself about it, because ultimately, show me a sci-fi story without a spaceship in it. You know, there are people with no legs, 2 legs, 3 legs, 4 legs, and more. The one-legged kind would just look pretty stupid, so no one uses that. So, you know, there are certain parameters when you're building your world where if you rather focus on the smaller things like relationships and interactions, the actual world building is just a different colored stage to plop these players on. So don't let it get you down too much, but yeah, feel free to experiment. There's so many amazing things out there.
There is so much that you can devise a different purpose for as well. You can take an everyday object that we use for one particular thing here, but you can make it do something else in another world.
Wow. That's so
like
cool.
the Little Mermaid who used a fork to brush her hair. She didn't know what it was for.
Exactly.
Without even leaving the kitchen, for example.
Yes.
So Richard, did you talk about creating new languages in your book?
No.
Languages for no?
Have you ever had the experience? English, I couldn't possibly think of another one.
Okay, all right.
No,
yeah, it is.
I don't think it's necessary. I haven't found it necessary so far. I've
Okay.
always managed to find a way around it.
Right,
I just don't like to complicate things. I like to keep it simple because I think that
Right.
the simpler it is, the easier it is to tell a story, and the easier it is to keep someone's attention. If you start making it too complicated, people tend to switch off.
You know, I agree with you actually. As I mean, as much as like earlier I said, I mean, I love Star Trek and I'm such a huge Trekkie and everything. I was never committed enough to learn Klingon, you know.
Me neither.
Do you know Klingon, Lene?
No. But I'm just always
No?
reminded of this father that joked about his son being such a disappointment, but in Klingon. But the son understood it perfectly well. So he's just like his dad. He's
Oh
not a
my
disappointment,
goodness.
but yeah,
Exactly. That's
it-
really
it-
commitment to a story. I think that's a little above and beyond. I agree with Richard. Keeping it simple in my way would be better too. I probably wouldn't go for the language thing, but
Yeah.
you know,
So
I mean,
I saw a debate on that on one of the Facebook writers groups earlier today, where someone was asking whether they should spell a character name with one I or two I's. And then they said it's actually pronounced a different way, which is a completely different spelling.
mm,
And that just got me thinking for a bit, because if you overcomplicate something like that, to make it sound, now here's the thing, if we use something strange in an alluring manner, it's called exotic. If we use it to invite fear, it's called foreign. And that's a very subtle distinction in the English language. When you talk about a person that you're attracted to from another nationality or another country, oh, they're so exotic. When you're scared of someone, oh, these foreigners. So when you want to make up new names and new words, for goodness sakes, please just use Google and make sure this word does not exist in another language already, where you're going to inadvertently get a whole bunch of foreign attention that you don't want.
wow,
And then
yeah.
rather just keep the pronunciation the way we would say it if it was written in English, because the reader doesn't want to go every time they see the character name. They want to move on with the story.
Yes.
So that's one of the little things in world building that I think people need to pay attention to, is place names, character names. Look, if it's a magical ritual or an ancient script that they found or an incantation, great. You're welcome to put a simple phrase in Google Translate, like, I squish the lemons with my toes, put it in another language and pop that in your book. And everyone who knows that language are going to go, hee, that's so funny. You've got a new fan base and you haven't offended anyone. But rather than come up with strange words or inadvertently putting in actual witchcraft or demonology words in there,
yes.
Please be
Don't
careful
want anybody
with the
really conjuring something.
Yeah.
I know we're closing out. Richard, before we go, where can everyone find your book, since it was so useful?
The book is available on Amazon. If you just search Richard D, all my books come up, and it's there somewhere. Amazon changed the order that they show them in all the time, but so I can't be any more specific than that. But if you type Richard D, or you type creating a sci-fi world, or even sci-fi world building, then the algorithm will show you my book.
Very cool.
That's lovely.
Cool.
That's terrific. Well, I guess we're about out of time for this episode of You, Me, and Iced Tea. I hope you guys will join us next time for another great topic. And always, always communicate with us. Let us know what you want us to talk about. Let us know if you have any questions as well. We're super helpful people and we'll answer you right away. So take care, and y'all come back now. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.